So why don't we have diversity? And I think the answer is unconscious bias, because we have prototypes for everything. Drug dealers, nuns, athletes. If I asked you to think of a basketball player, everyone think of a basketball player. Who do you see? A Denver Nugget? Maybe not, but probably most people thought of an African-American man. Very few people think of a woman, very few people think of a white guy. But beyond just thinking of an African-American man when you think of a basketball player, on some level, don't you also think African-American men are better basketball players? I mean, it makes sense. African-American men comprise 13% of the US population and 74% of the NBA. Just do the math, right? They must be better basketball players. And that's the problem with prototypes. They don't just tell you what is, but they tell you what should be, and it starts to become the perfect example of what we expect. This is the 1953 NBA champion Minneapolis Lakers. These are your Lakers. And my point is just that our prototypes and our expectations change with what we see, because what we see becomes what we expect. Now think of a CEO. We probably all think of a white man. But here's the thing. You don't just think of a white man when you think of a CEO. You also think white men are better CEOs. On some level, everyone denies it. No, it's, historical legacy. But white men are 31% of the US population, and they're 91% of Fortune 500 CEOs. So your brain thinks, even if you won't admit it, that white men are better CEOs. And it's this difference that we have in our expectations for leaders that cause us to evaluate male leaders very differently from female leaders, white leaders very different from minority leaders. And I found this in a study that I did earlier this year where we looked at the very behavior I'm engaging in right now, which is diversity valuing behavior, and found that when women and minorities value diversity, when they do really basic things like respecting differences, valuing working with different types of people, and being comfortable managing diverse employees, they're actually seen as less competent and less effective by their bosses. And this wasn't true for white men, but it does show how strong unconscious bias can be. But my goal was not to stand here and bemoan all the problems with unconscious bias. Instead, I want to focus on what's next. How do we mitigate unconscious bias? And so I've created the ABCs of breaking bias, and I want to share those with you here today. The first one is admit it, and it's this process called ironic thought suppression. If you try not to think about something, the fact is you focus more on it, and it's more likely to affect your behavior. How is this relevant to diversity? A lot of organizations focus on being colorblind and gender blind. Let's not talk about race and gender. And the research shows that that actually has the opposite effect as intended. It causes people to make more biased, more gender biased and racially biased decisions. So let's just admit it. We know we all have unconscious biases. It's totally natural. And although it's not okay to let them affect our behavior, if we don't admit that they do, they're just going to affect our behavior more. So we're going to start with just admitting it. If we admit it, we can engage in practices that help mitigate bias, like blinding procedures. This was made very popular in the 1970s by the National Symphony Orchestra, which had fewer than 5% women. And there was some notion that there may be gender bias in auditions for the National Symphony. And so they did something really innovative. They dropped a curtain during auditions, and they had women take off their shoes so you wouldn't hear the clacking of heels across the stage. And today, 50% of the National Symphony Orchestra is women, and 30% of the overall change was attributed to this intervention. Based on that, I stole the idea and did a really similar intervention at the Hubble Space Telescope, where women are very underrepresented as astrophysicists. And what we found was there was a bias of male evaluators evaluating female principal investigators. So we took the names off the applications. And 1 year later, after we blinded it, male evaluators actually rated female principal investigators the best of any group. And what's more is you can never say, it's reverse discrimination, oh, they're overcompensating, because they actually have no idea who wrote the application. But it showed that there was a bias, and we got rid of it. This is especially effective during early stages of applications, and many, many companies are starting to use it. So the B in the ABCs of breaking bias is blind it. The C is count it. Any organizational initiative that improves company performance, impacts bottom line outcomes, the company is going to set targets and they're going to measure their success. Why don't we do this with diversity? Well, in fact, some of the best companies in America do. So, for example, Starbucks has set a goal of increasing the number of women and minorities in their executive leadership ranks by 50% by 2020. And the benefit of having a goal is you can measure your progress toward it. This initiative didn't work, maybe another one does. So let's count it. Finally, the S is support it. And that means everyone, not just women and minorities, because we know that that can cause them to be evaluated as less effective, but white men as well. This isn't a woman problem or a minority problem. It is an initiative that can overall improve global economic health and organizational performance. So we should all be working together to achieve it.